Yellow Medicine Bottoms, Minnesota, August 1881. The air was thick with the late summer drone of insects, and the prairie grass, baked to a pale gold, shimmered under a relentless sun. In a landscape defined by sharp, angular lines, the clapboard church, the grid of section roads, the severe rectangles of sod houses, Andrei Tomescu's project was a baffling curve. He was building a hill. For weeks, the settlers had watched. Tomescu, the quiet Romanian who had arrived the previous year, worked with a rhythm that was both alien and hypnotic. He wasn't framing with timber or cutting sod. He was mixing mud, sand, and straw in a great shallow pit, his children, Mihai and Anka, stomping it with their bare feet. His wife, Elena, hauled buckets of water from the creek. They were packing this dense, heavy mixture, cob, the old-timers called it, around a huge 11-foot iron cylinder stove that stood nakedly on a stone foundation in the middle of his quarter section. Forrest Lindquist, captain of the region's most successful threshing ring, stopped his wagon on the rise overlooking Tomescu's land. He was a man whose world was governed by steam, steel, and efficiency. He understood tolerances, boiler pressures, and the precise mechanics of a McCormick reaper. What he was seeing below made no sense. "He's burying his stove, Jed," Lindquist said, gesturing with his chin to Jedediah Miller, a farmer whose wheat they'd be threshing next week. "Intentionally?" Miller squinted. "I heard he was building a house, Forrest. That just looks like he's making a mud dauber's nest big enough for a bear. It's the most foolish thing I've seen since Henderson tried to plow with oxen in a lightning storm." The structure had no visible walls, only a single, low doorway framed in heavy timber. The earthen mound was already 5 feet thick, a lumpy, organic dome that seemed to be growing out of the prairie. Lindquist had seen men build with sod, with logs, with fieldstone. He had never seen a man build a home that looked like a burial mound for his own stove. He drove his wagon down the track and pulled up near the work site. Tomescu nodded a greeting, his hands and forearms coated in a thick glove of drying mud. "Tomescu," Lindquist began, foregoing pleasantries, "I'm not one to meddle, but my professional opinion is that you're creating a problem for yourself. 2 problems, in fact." Andrei paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a clean wrist. He waited. "First," Lindquist said, pointing a thick finger at the wet gray wall, "that mud is sitting directly against your iron. Come the first freeze-thaw, it'll sweat. The moisture will be trapped. That wet cob will rot your iron clean through in 2 winters. You'll have nothing but a rusty shell surrounded by a pile of dirt." He paused for effect, letting the certainty of his diagnosis settle. "Second, look at the shape of it. It's a perfect drift catcher. The first big blow from the northwest, and that damned hill you're making will pile snow clear over your door. You'll be trapped in there, digging yourselves out till spring." The other men with Lindquist, farmers, and threshing hands nodded in solemn agreement. It was common sense. Iron rusted. Wind made drifts. These were laws of the Minnesota winter. Andrei Tomescu looked at his strange, curving wall. He looked at the hard, clear sky. Then he looked at Forrest Lindquist, a man of undisputed competence in his own world. "The iron will be dry," he said, his English quiet and deliberate. "The door will be clear." Then he turned, picked up another load of the heavy cob, and slapped it onto the wall, resuming the steady, patient rhythm of his work. Lindquist watched for another minute, then shook his head and clucked to his horses. The man was a fool, a quiet, hard-working fool, perhaps, but a fool nonetheless. The mockery was gentle but pervasive. In the evenings at Silas Blackwood's general store, men would ask, "Seen Tomescu's dirt pile lately? Wonder if he's planning to grow potatoes on his roof." The Romanian's folly was a source of mild amusement. A strange story to tell. A fixed point of eccentricity in a community that valued conformity and proven methods. What did this Romanian Cupter Mason, a man from the forested foothills of the Carpathians, understand about the unforgiving physics of a prairie winter that a man who ran a steam thresher, a master of heat and pressure, had so completely missed? This channel is dedicated to the stories of quiet ingenuity, of forgotten wisdom that solved impossible problems. The story of Andrei Tomescu is one of the most remarkable. I promise you, by the end of this account, you will understand the deep science behind his madness. So, subscribe, click the bell, and get ready to learn how a pile of mud can defeat a Minnesota blizzard. And let me know in the comments, what's the strangest, most counterintuitive solution you've ever seen work? Andrei Tomescu was not a carpenter. He knew nothing of mortise and tenon joints, of king posts or rafters. He was not a farmer, baffled by the vast, flat geometry of the American plains, so different from the crowded, tilted valleys of his homeland. He was a Cupter Mason. His entire life, and his father's life before him, had been spent working with the primal elements of earth, water, straw, and fire. He had built the great beehive-shaped ovens that formed the heart of every Romanian village. His hands knew the specific feel of river clay versus hillside clay, the exact amount of sand needed to prevent cracking. The way willow switches woven into a lattice could give the earth walls a skeleton to cling to. He understood heat not as a violent momentary event, the blast of a fire, but as a slow, deep-breathing presence that could be coaxed into a mass of earth and persuaded to stay for hours, even days. His trade was the craft of thermal memory. This deep, tactile knowledge had been useless during their first winter in yellow medicine. They had spent it in a rented claim shack, a standard frontier cabin built of thin pine boards with gaping seams. It was a structure designed only to keep out the wind, not the cold. The cold was a physical entity that seeped through the walls, radiated from the single-pane windows, and poured down the chimney. Their stove, a small cast-iron box, was a tyrant. It demanded constant feeding, roaring to life and turning the wall behind it dangerously hot, while the far corners of the single room remained freezing. The moment the fire died down, the cold crashed back in. The suffering of that winter was etched into Andrei's memory through a series of sharp, sensory details. He remembered the kerosene in the lantern thickening on the coldest nights, the flame sputtering in a waxy, translucent syrup. He remembered the vinegar bottle on the shelf, a solid slush of ice in the morning, the sharp scent trapped within. Most vividly, he remembered the stove's iron handle. Even with the fire blazing, the handle would grow so cold that it would bite with the ferocity of a burn. One morning, reaching to open the firebox door with a folded rag, he felt the brutal cold strike through the cloth, a pain so sharp and sudden it was like being stabbed with an icicle. That was the moment he knew he could not survive another winter like that. He would not subject Elena, Mihai, and Anka to that kind of cold. He would build what he knew. He would build a cupter large enough to live inside. The failure of the conventional frontier cabin was not a failure of materials, but a failure of philosophy. The settlers, mostly from Northern European or New England stock, thought of a house as a thin skin. Their goal was to create a barrier, a shell to keep the weather out. But the Minnesota cold was too powerful. It was a force with the weight and pressure of an ocean. A thin wall was meaningless against it. The primary problem was the near-total lack of thermal mass. The log cabins and board and batten shacks had walls of wood, a material with very poor heat capacity. A pound of wood can store only a fraction of the heat energy that a pound of earth or stone can. This meant the structures themselves held no warmth. The only heat in the house was the heat in the air, and the air was constantly leaking out through 100 unsealed gaps. The stove, the heart of the home, was part of the problem. It was a creature of iron, a material that heats up incredibly fast and cools down just as quickly. It was a fast fire system. When the fire was roaring, it threw off thousands of BTUs of radiant heat, making the area around it intolerably hot. But it was a fleeting, temporary victory. The heat radiated outwards, struck the cold, thin walls, and was immediately conducted to the outside. The moment the fire was banked for the night, the iron stove cooled in less than an hour, becoming nothing more than another cold metal object in a freezing room. The house had no thermal memory. It forgot the fire almost instantly. For families like the Millers, this meant a state of perpetual battle. They were burning through immense stacks of cordwood, sometimes a cord a week during the coldest spells. The men spent half their waking hours felling, splitting, and hauling wood. The women and children lived in a constant, oppressive chill, huddled near the stove, wearing coats indoors. The windows were opaque with interior frost from dawn till dusk. The water bucket in the corner would be skinned with ice every morning. They were living on the edge of hypothermia, their lives dictated by the ravenous appetite of the stove. The problem wasn't the fire. The problem was the house's inability to hold on to the gift of the fire. Andrei's work began in September, after the last of the hay was in. The foundation was simple, a ring of field stones dug below the frost line, creating a stable, dry base. On this, he and Elena placed the 11-foot iron cylinder stove, a long, horizontal drum that had once been part of a steam boiler, purchased for scrap from Lindquist himself. He oriented it east-west, with the firebox door facing the spot where his main door would be. He ran the stovepipe straight up, a simple vertical flue that would exit through the top of the mound to come. Then the real work began, the work the neighbors found so bizarre. He drove dozens of sharpened willow stakes into the ground around the stove, forming a wide, circular perimeter. Between these stakes, he wove a lattice of thinner, more flexible willow branches, creating a rough, basket-like skeleton. These were the newel, the keys, that would give the cob a structure to grip, preventing it from slumping or shearing under its own immense weight. The mixing pit was the center of their world for 3 weeks. Mihai and Anka, their legs caked in mud to the knees, stomped and sang as they worked the water and straw into the heavy clay soil he dug from the creek bank. It was a specific recipe Andrei knew by feel. Not too wet, lest it slump. Not too dry, lest it crack. He needed the plasticity of clay, the aggregate strength of sand, and the tensile strength of the long straw fibers. He applied the cob by hand, in great heavy loaves. He started at the base, packing it in and around the willow lattice, working his way up in thick, concentric layers. Elena worked alongside him, her movements mirroring his, a silent, efficient partnership honed by years of shared labor. They did not use forms or frames. They sculpted the house, their hands, and the soles of their feet the only tools. Forrest Lindquist made his second visit in early October. The mound was nearly complete, a massive, windowless dome of drying earth, gray and cracked like an elephant's hide. It was over 20 feet in diameter at its base. The walls were 5 feet thick on the south, east, and west sides, but on the north-northwest face, the direction of the prevailing winter winds, Andrei had thickened it to a full 7 feet of solid earth. The only openings were the low, stoutly framed doorway, and the stovepipe sticking out of the top like a strange chimney on a hobbit's hill. Lindquist dismounted, accompanied this time by Silas Blackwood, the store owner, a man whose ledger books were the definitive record of the community's hardships. "Still at it, I see," Lindquist said, walking around the base and kicking it with his boot. It was already hardening to the consistency of soft rock. He repeated his earlier warnings, his voice laced with genuine, if condescending, concern. That wet mud will rot your iron, Tomescu. I sold you that boiler. I know its gauge. It won't last 2 seasons. Silas Blackwood chimed in, his tone more practical. And the drift, Andrei. Forrest is right. We had a northeaster in '78 that buried Henderson's barn to the eaves. His barn has a peaked roof to shed the snow. This thing of yours, it's shaped like a ramp. The snow will go up and over and fall right in front of your door. You'll be sealed in. Andrei was applying a final, smoother plaster coat made of finer clay and manure. He ran his palm over the curving surface. He pointed to the north-northwest face, the thickest part. Wind hits here, he said. He then traced a line with his finger up and over the dome. Snow goes with wind, over the top. Door is here, he said, pointing to the south-facing entrance. In the quiet air, it will be clear. As for the rust, he simply shook his head. Fire will keep iron dry. The earth will hold the heat of the fire. Dry heat. No rust. His confidence was absolute, but it was not arrogant. It was the simple certainty of a craftsman who trusted his material. Lindquist and Blackwood exchanged a look. There was no arguing with the man. They mounted their horses and rode off, convinced they would be part of a rescue party come January, digging out the poor, stubborn Romanian and his family. The mockery lasted through the fall. The validation would last for the next 50 years. To understand what Andrei Tomescu had built, you have to understand a fundamental principle of thermal physics, the difference between insulation and thermal mass. The settlers' cabins were attempts at insulation. They were trying to build a barrier to stop the flow of heat. But their materials were insufficient, and the cold was too great. It was like trying to dam a flood with a wicker fence. Andrei's approach was entirely different. He had built a thermal battery. The key concept is heat capacity, which is the measure of how much heat energy a given mass of a substance can store. Water has a very high heat capacity. Metals have a low one. The dense, compacted earth of Andrei's cob walls had a massive heat capacity. Let's do the math. The mound contained roughly 3,000 cubic feet of compacted earth. At a density of 120 pounds per cubic foot, the total weight of the cob mantle was approximately 360,000 pounds, or 180 tons. It was, for all intents and purposes, a man-made geological feature. This immense mass acted as a heat sink. When Andrei fired up the iron stove, he wasn't just heating the small volume of air inside the house. He was pouring thousands upon thousands of BTUs of energy into the 180-ton earthen mantle surrounding him. The iron cylinder, which heated up quickly, transferred its energy via radiation and convection to the inner surface of the cob wall. That heat then began a slow, deliberate journey, migrating through the dense material toward the colder outer surface. But that journey took a very, very long time. This is the principle of thermal mass damping. In a conventional cabin, the indoor temperature is directly and immediately tied to the fire. Fire on, temperature spikes. Fire off, temperature plummets. The diurnal swing is extreme. In Andrei's house, the massive earthen mantle acted as a buffer, or a damper. It flattened that curve completely. Think of it like this. A small bucket of water thrown on a hot rock flashes into steam instantly. A massive lake, however, takes all summer to warm up and all autumn to cool down. Andrei's house was the lake. The fire was the summer sun. He would run a hot fire for a few hours in the morning, charging the inner layer of the thermal mass. Then he would let the fire die down. The iron stove, jacketed by the immense warmth of the earth around it, could not shed its heat quickly. It was forced to cool at the same slow pace as the mantle itself. The house breathed out its stored warmth over the next 10 to 12 hours, maintaining a stable, comfortable temperature. The daily fire wasn't a desperate battle for survival. It was a calm, predictable act of charging his earthen battery. The settlers saw a foolish pile of mud. Andrei had built a slow, patient body that knew how to remember the fire. The winter of 1881 arrived not with a gentle slide, but with a sudden, violent slam. In the second week of December, the first Alberta clipper swept down from the Canadian prairies. It was not a storm of heavy snow, but of pure, crystalline cold. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 12 hours. The sky was a hard, pale, unforgiving blue. The wind was a knife. The thermometer at Blackwood's store registered 34.0 degrees, and then it stayed there. For 13 days, a sequence of 6 dry cold fronts pulsed south, one after another, with no intervening warm-up. There was no recovery, no sun-drenched afternoon to melt the frost, no respite. It was just a continuous, grinding, soul-crushing cold. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a siege. The world shrank to the small circle of warmth around the stove. The miller's cabin was a misery. Their windows were coated in a thick, feathery layer of ice on the inside, blocking what little light the winter sun offered. Every nail head in the walls was white with frost, a tiny thermal bridge conducting the cold directly into their living space. They burned through their woodpile at a terrifying rate. Jedediah Miller was out in the woodlot every day, his breath freezing in his beard, his axe ringing in the brittle air just to keep up. Inside Andrei Tomescu's mound, a different reality prevailed. Their single room was perhaps 18 feet in diameter, the curving walls plastered smooth and whitewashed, the air still and quiet. There were no drafts. The only sound was the gentle hiss of the banked fire and the soft sounds of family life. Andrei would build a roaring fire in the iron cylinder for 3 hours after waking. The heat was intense but not oppressive, soaking into the deep walls. He'd do the same for 4 hours in the evening. For the other 17 hours of the day, the fire was either a bed of coals or completely out. Yet the temperature inside never dropped below 60 degrees. The massive walls, saturated with warmth, gently radiated it back into the room. The contrast with the outside world was absolute. Outside, 34 degrees. Inside, a stable, livable warmth. This was proven by the smallest domestic details. On a shelf built into the earthen wall, Elena kept a stoneware crock of lard. When she needed some, she could scoop it out with a wooden spoon. It was soft, yielding, and spread easily on the dark bread she baked. In Jedediah Miller's cabin, their lard was a solid, white rock in its crock. To use it, his wife had to chip off shards with a knife and melt them. Struck with a spoon, the Tomescus' lard would make a soft thud. The Millers would ring like porcelain. This was the proof of the house. The mundane was possible. Anka and Mihai could play on the packed earth floor in their woolen socks, not bundled in layers of coats. Life was not a struggle. It was simply life. The 5th clipper, arriving on the 10th day of the cold spell, was the worst. The temperature held at 34 degrees C, but now the wind rose to a gale, scouring the landscape with fine, hard ice crystals. The wind chill was a lethal, unthinkable number. It was a day to be inside, behind a locked door. But Forrest Lindquist and his 2-man threshing crew were caught out. They were moving a steam tractor and separator from one farm to another, a slow, arduous process in the deep cold. They were 3 miles from the nearest farmstead when the wind hit its peak, a horizontal blizzard of ice and frozen earth. The horses, their coats already thick with rime, began to panic, turning their backs to the wind and refusing to move. The air was too dangerous to breathe, searing the lungs. Lindquist scanned the horizon. There was nothing, just the flat, white, windswept plain. And then he saw it, a low, dark shape on the horizon, the only feature that broke the unforgiving line of the earth and sky. Tomescu's Hill. It was their only chance. "To the mound!" he yelled over the shriek of the wind. It's our only windbreak." They fought their way across the open ground, the men shielding their faces, the horses plunging through the shallow, scoured drifts. As they drew closer, Lindquist saw that Andrei's prediction had been uncannily accurate. The north-northwest face of the mound, the 7-foot-thick wall, was taking the full fury of the blizzard. The wind was hitting the curve and flowing up and over it, a perfect aerodynamic foil. The snow was not drifting in front of the door. It was being scoured away from the south side, leaving the ground almost bare. In the lee of the mound, on the south side where the door was, the air was almost calm. It was a pocket of stillness in the heart of the gale. He brought the horses and his men, Carter and Beauchamp, into this sanctuary. The relief was immediate and profound. The wind howled over their heads, but down at ground level, they could finally catch their breath. The horses quieted, their trembling sides heaving. As he stood there, stamping his feet to restore feeling, Lindquist looked at the structure that had been the object of his confident mockery. The north face was a mask of white frost, frozen as hard as iron. But here, on the south face, the packed earth looked different. There was no frost on it. Driven by a curiosity that overrode the biting cold, he pulled off his thick leather glove. His men looked at him, thinking him mad. He pressed his bare palm flat against the hard, cold mud of the wall. He was expecting a searing, sticking cold, the kind that would instantly rob his skin of all heat. He braced for the pain, but it never came. Instead, what he felt was so impossible, so contrary to every law of nature, as he understood it, that his mind struggled to process it. Through 5 feet of frozen earth from deep within the mound, he felt a steady, gentle, unmistakable warmth pushing back against his hand. It wasn't hot. It wasn't even warm like a living thing. It was a deep, resonant energy, a thermal presence. It was the heat from Andrei's morning fire, a fire that had been out for 6 hours, on its slow, patient journey to the outside world. It was the stored memory of combustion, held in 180 tons of earth. Lindquist stood motionless for a full minute, his bare hand pressed against the impossible wall, the wind screaming over his head. Carter and Beauchamp watched him, their faces pinched with cold and confusion. In that moment, Forrest Lindquist's rigid, certain world of steam and steel was shattered and remade. He understood. He finally, completely understood. He didn't knock on the door. He didn't need to see inside. The proof was right here, under his own hand. Turning to his men, his voice full of a strange awe, he said a line they would repeat for years. He didn't build a house. He built a season. When the great cold broke, Forrest Lindquist returned to Andrei Tomescu's mound. There was no grand apology, no dramatic recanting. That wasn't the way of these men. Instead, there was quiet respect and a series of practical questions. He didn't ask if it worked. He asked how it worked. The mix, Tomescu. What's the ratio of clay to sand? The willow. How deep do you set the stakes? The flue. How do you keep the rain out without a proper cap? Andrei answered every question simply and directly, without a trace of triumphalism. He shared his knowledge as freely as he would share a cup of water. He explained that the fire-dried earth around the stovepipe itself became a form of ceramic, impervious to water. He showed Lindquist how the woven willow keys gave the structure a tensile strength that solid earth lacked. Lindquist was more than just a farmer. He was the captain of a threshing ring. This gave him a unique position of influence. His crew, with their massive steam engine and separator, traveled a circuit of 24 farms every harvest season. He was a trusted authority on machinery, weather, and efficiency. His word carried weight. That summer of 1882, as he made his rounds, Lindquist became the apostle of the Tomescu method. After settling the accounts for the threshing, he would pull out the paper contract, turn it over, and with a carpenter's pencil, sketch a clean, simple cross-section of the earthen house. He'd draw the iron stove, the thick mantle, the north-facing mass, the south-facing door. "This is the Tomescu plan," he would tell the farmers gathered around him. "He burns a third of the wood I do, and his children don't sleep in their coats. The mud holds the heat. It's a slow fire, not a fast one." He would tell the story of standing in the lee of the mound during the blizzard, of the impossible warmth he felt through the frozen wall. The idea spread like a prairie fire. It wasn't a matter of fashion. It was a matter of survival. The memory of the previous winter was raw and painful. That fall, construction began all across the Yellow Medicine bottoms. By the time the first snows of 1882 fell, 22 families had built their own versions of the Cupter house. Some were smaller, some were built over existing cellars, some used fieldstone in the mix. But the core principle, a massive thermal battery charged by an internal fire, was the same in all of them. The fuel savings were revolutionary. Families that had budgeted 12 cords of wood for the winter found they needed only 4. The Tomescu mound had changed the thermal economy of the entire region. Andrei Tomescu, with his ancient craft-based knowledge, had built a structure that anticipated the most advanced principles of modern building science by nearly a century. What he created was, in essence, a passive, high-mass dwelling. Modern architects and engineers use terms like thermal mass damping, heat capacity, and phase change materials to describe the very phenomena Andrei understood in his hands. A modern passive house is designed to be airtight and super insulated, but many also incorporate significant thermal mass, concrete floors, thick masonry walls, to achieve the same effect Tomescu did. These elements absorb solar heat during the day or heat from the occupants and appliances, and then slowly release it at night, dramatically flattening the temperature curve and reducing the need for active heating or cooling. A trombe wall, a specific passive solar design element, works on an almost identical principle. A glass plate is set a few inches outside a dark, high-mass wall, creating a space where air is heated by the sun and then circulates into the house, while the wall itself absorbs and stores heat for later release. Andrei's iron stove was the sun, and his 7-foot-thick north wall was a thermal buffer of immense power. He had created a low-tech, self-regulating system that achieved a level of comfort and efficiency that his neighbors' thin-skinned houses could never approach. He wasn't just building a shelter, he was building a climate. There is a philosophy of time embedded in the way we build. The American frontier, in its rush to claim and conquer the continent, built for speed. The log cabin, and especially the board and batten shack, were expressions of immediacy. They went up fast, they provided shelter fast, and they failed fast. Their relationship with heat was frantic and desperate, a constant, roaring fire to battle a constant, invading cold. The house itself had no memory, no patience. It existed only in the present moment of the fire. Andrei Tomescu brought with him a different kind of time, an older, slower, more cyclical understanding shaped by seasons and the deep, breathing life of a kiln. He built a slow, patient body that took all day to forget the fire. His house was not a barrier against the winter, but a vessel for warmth. It did not fight the cold with a furious, fleeting rage. It absorbed the energy of the fire and held it with a deep, earthen persistence. It had a memory of heat that lasted through the longest, coldest nights. The frontier, for all its prejudices, was ultimately a pragmatic place. It did not reward credentials or tradition or eloquent arguments. It rewarded what worked. And when Forrest Lindquist placed his hand on that wall and felt the stored warmth pushing back against the fury of the blizzard, the argument was over. The slow, patient wisdom of the Romanian earth mason had proven itself superior to the fast, brittle logic of the pioneer builder. The community didn't adopt his method because it was foreign or interesting. They adopted it because it kept their children warm. In the end, the land itself decides what knowledge is true. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of thermal physics and historical building as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of forgotten genius. We read every comment, so please share your thoughts. What other old world techniques do you know of that could solve modern problems? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect, while the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and engineering regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.